The morning Harlow Dakarai walked into that boardroom, she was wearing the same gray blazer she'd bought at a value village in Sudbury 12 years earlier. She hadn't replaced it. Not because she couldn't afford to. She absolutely could, but because that jacket had been on her back. The day she signed the papers on her first property, and she was not a woman who let go of things that had served her well. But the men sitting around that table didn't know any of that. They saw the jacket. They saw her. And they made their decision before she even pulled out a chair. Before we get into what happened next, if you're new here, welcome to Heirloom Tales. We tell the stories that don't always make the headlines, but probably should. Hit that like button if you stay until the end. Because what those men didn't know about Harlow Dakarai is going to take your breath away. Now, let's go back to where this really started. Harlow grew up in a house with a leaking roof in a small town outside Thunder Bay, Ontario. Her father, Emmanuel Dakarai, had emigrated from Zimbabwe in 1978 with $40, a suitcase, and a particular kind of stubbornness that his daughter would inherit completely. He worked the timber yards for 31 years. He never missed a shift. He never complained, at least not where his children could hear him. And every single month, without exception, he set aside something. Not much, but something. He used to say, "A river doesn't announce itself, it just keeps moving." Harlow was the youngest of four. She watched her father work. She watched him save. She watched the way certain people spoke to him at the hardware store, at the bank. At the town council meetings he attended faithfully, even though nobody seemed particularly glad to see him there. She filed all of it away, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with attention. The kind of attention that becomes its own kind of education. She left for university at 18, came back at 23 with a degree in business administration, and a head full of ideas that Thunder Bay, frankly, wasn't ready for. She worked 4 years at a property management firm in Sudbury. Learned the business from the floor up. Watched how money moved, where it pooled, where it drained away. Started buying small. A duplex in Timmins, a decommissioned warehouse outside Sault Ste. Marie that everyone else thought was a lost cause. It wasn't a lost cause. She was 31 when she registered her company, Dakarai Property Holdings. By the time she was 44, she owned or co-owned 14 commercial and residential properties across northern Ontario. She employed 22 people. She had never missed a mortgage payment in her life. She also drove a second-hand Subaru and had not updated her work wardrobe in longer than she cared to admit. She wasn't flashy. She didn't see the point. Her father had never been flashy either, and his money had been just as real. She had learned, over the years, to read a room fast. To know within the first 60 seconds whether she was going to be taken seriously or managed. Whether the person across the table was actually listening, or whether they were simply waiting for her to stop talking so they could say what they'd already decided. She was good at reading rooms. Walking into Meridian Chambers that October morning, she read it immediately. Meridian Chambers was a commercial real estate firm, headquartered in a glass and steel building in downtown Sudbury. They had recently begun brokering a major development project, a mixed-use retail and housing complex on a piece of land at the eastern edge of the city. A project the local press had been calling the biggest private development in the region in a decade. Harlow had been tracking it for 8 months. She had done her numbers 3 times. She had the capital, the track record, and the regional connections to be a serious partner in the deal. She had requested a meeting through their online investor portal in August. She had followed up in September. She had finally received a confirmation in late October, a 30-minute slot with the firm's managing partners. There were 4 men waiting when she arrived. She recognized 2 of them from the firm's website. The senior managing partner was a man named Clifton Hale. Silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of handshake that tells you he has practiced it. Beside him sat his co-partner, a man named Stuart Renwick, younger, with the cautious eyes of someone who has learned to defer to Clifton Hale in almost everything. The other 2 were associates, whose names Harlow would later have to ask her assistant to look up. Clifton Hale looked at her when she came in, nodded her face. At the jacket, she saw it. The particular kind of assessment that tries to look like nothing. She sat down. She placed her portfolio on the table. She introduced herself fully. Her name, her company, her interest in the Eastfield development. She spoke clearly and without hurrying. Clifton Hale let her finish. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "And you're here on behalf of which organization?" She paused. "My own. Dakarai Property Holdings. As I mentioned." Right. He nodded in the way people nod when they are not processing what you have just said. "And you're, what, looking at a consulting role? Community liaison? That sort of thing?" The room was very quiet. One of the associates shifted in his chair. Harlow looked at Clifton Hale for a moment. Then she said, "I'm here to discuss a co-investment position. I outlined the parameters in my initial inquiry. I have documentation here." She opened her portfolio. She slid a 2-page summary across the table. Audited financial statements. Portfolio overview. A preliminary proposal for a 40% stake in the Eastfield project, with a full financing plan. Clifton Hale glanced at the first page. He did not pick it up. "We really are looking for institutional partners on this one," he said. "Big players. Pension funds, REITs, that sort of scale. I'm not sure this is the right fit." He smiled, and the smile was perfectly polite, and it meant nothing at all. "But we do have a community partnership stream. Local business owners, small operators. I can have someone send you that information. Much more appropriate for." "I'm not a small operator," Harlow said. Her voice was level. She did not raise it. She had learned a long time ago that a raised voice in a room like this only ever works against you. "The documentation in front of you shows 14 properties, 12 years of consecutive positive returns, and current liquid assets of just under $3 million. My financing for this project is secured and can be verified. I'm not here about a community partnership stream. I'm here to discuss an investment position." Stuart Renwick picked up the document. He read the first page. His expression changed. Something tightening slightly, recalculating. He turned to the second page. Clifton Hale had not moved. "We appreciate you coming in," he said. "We'll be in touch." It was 14 minutes into a 30-minute meeting. Harlow closed her portfolio. She stood. She looked at Clifton Hale for just a moment longer than was comfortable. And then she thanked him for his time, shook hands with each of them, even the 2 associates who seemed to have forgotten where they were, and walked out. In the elevator, going down, she stared at the brushed steel doors and thought about her father and the river that didn't announce itself. She kept moving. Now, if you've ever walked out of a room knowing exactly what just happened, knowing it in your bones, but also knowing that nobody in that room will ever say it out loud, leave a comment below, because that experience is something. That is its own particular weight to carry. Harlow carried it home. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. She called her business manager, a woman named Adora Ize, who had been with her for 7 years, and who had the gift of listening, without immediately trying to fix things. She told her what happened. Adora said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" And Harlow said, "I want to build something so airtight they never get to make that face at me again." Adora said, "Okay, let's build it." That was October. What Clifton Hale did not know, could not have known, because he had not read the documents in front of him, had not looked up her company name, had not done what any serious investor would do before a meeting of this kind, was that Harlow Dakarai had, 3 weeks earlier, quietly finalized an agreement to acquire a controlling interest in a land-holding company called Lakeshore North Resources. Lakeshore North Resources owned, among other things, a significant parcel of land on the western boundary of the Eastfield development site, a parcel without which the project's access road could not be legally built. She hadn't planned it that way. Or not exactly. She had been tracking Lakeshore North for 2 years, because the land itself had long-term value, independent of any development. But when the Eastfield project had been announced, she had looked at the maps and done the math, and understood something that the Meridian Chambers team, apparently, had not yet figured out. The project could not proceed without that land, and the land was hers. She did not call Meridian Chambers. She did not send a letter. She did not announce anything. She went back to work. She had her lawyers review the access road provisions in the Eastfield development filing. she had a surveyor out to the western parcel in November. She got quiet confirmation from the city's planning office that yes, the access provisions in the current proposal assumed use of that land corridor, and no, there was no secondary route that met municipal standards. She put everything in a file. She waited. In December, she began to hear through her network, and Harlow Dakarai, despite driving a second-hand Subaru and not updating her wardrobe, had an extensive network, that Meridian Chambers was having difficulty finalizing the project's infrastructure agreements, that there were complications, that the timeline was slipping. She heard in early January that they had brought in an additional partner, a Toronto-based development group, to try to move things along. That this new partner had looked at the site plans and immediately flagged the western land access issue as a serious problem. She heard that Clifton Hale had told the Toronto group that they were working on it. They were not working on it because they did not yet know who they were working with. Then, on a Wednesday morning in late January, 4 months after that meeting in the Glass and Steel building, Harlow's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Miss Dakarai? This is Stuart Renwick." From Meridian Chambers, she let a beat pass. "Yes. We wanted to reach out, actually. We've been looking more carefully at your October proposal, and I think there may have been a miscommunication on our end. We'd love to set up a call to discuss the Eastfield project again, if you're still interested." Harlow looked out her office window. The St. Mary's River was frozen and perfectly still. "I appreciate the call," she said. "I'll have my lawyers reach out to yours. I think at this stage it probably makes sense to formalize things properly." She paused. "There are some land access matters we'll need to discuss as well." There was silence on the line. Then Stuart Renwick said carefully, "Right, yes, of course." After she hung up, she sat for a moment. She did not feel triumphant, exactly. It wasn't that kind of feeling. It was something quieter and more complete. The feeling of a thing arriving in its own time. She thought of her father. A river doesn't announce itself. If you're still watching, and I hope you are, subscribe to Heirloom Tales if you haven't already. We're here every week with stories that deserve to be told. Now let me tell you how the rest of this unfolded, because what happened in those negotiations is where this story gets genuinely remarkable. Harlow's lawyer was a man named Tobias Mensah Owusu, who had been practicing real estate law in Sudbury for 26 years, and who had a reputation for being almost impossibly thorough. When Meridian Chambers received his firm's first letter, outlining Harlow's ownership stake in Lakeshore North Resources and the implications for the Eastfield Development's access road, Tobias later said that the response from their counsel had taken 4 days longer than it should have. "That usually means they're having internal conversations," he told Harlow, "trying to figure out how they got here." The answer, of course, was that they had not done their homework. They had seen a woman in a gray blazer and made an assumption so complete that they had never looked up her company name, had never verified what she had told them about her assets, had not apparently thought it worth their time. The negotiations that followed were professional and cordial, and, for Clifton Hale, Harlow suspected, deeply uncomfortable. She attended 3 of the 4 sessions in person. She dressed the same as she always dressed. She was prepared. She was precise. She did not mention the October meeting. She did not need to. What emerged from those sessions was a co-investment agreement that gave Dakarai Property Holdings a 35% stake in the Eastfield development, plus a formal easement arrangement for the Western Land Corridor that included provisions protecting her land rights for the duration of the project. It was not everything she had originally proposed. It was, in some respects, better. The deal was signed on a Thursday in March. Harlow took a photo of the signature page and sent it to Adaora with no caption. Adaora sent back 3 fire emojis. That was the full extent of the celebration. Word traveled, as it always does. The Sudbury business community is not large, and this kind of agreement, the scale of it, the parties involved, the way it had come together, was the sort of thing people noticed and talked about. Harlow's name began appearing in local business coverage in a way it hadn't before. There were requests for interviews. A regional chamber of commerce asked her to speak at their spring luncheon. She agreed to the luncheon. She declined most of the rest. There is one moment from that period, though, that she has talked about, and that I want to tell you about, because I think it captures something true. About 6 weeks after the deal closed, she was at the municipal offices, handling some routine filings related to one of her older properties. She was standing at the counter when a man came to stand beside her at the next wicket. She recognized him. It was one of the associates from that October meeting. One of the two she'd had to ask her assistant to look up. He didn't recognize her at first. He was filling out his own forms. Then he glanced over, and she watched his face as he placed her. "Watch the calculation run," he said. "Miss Dakarai." "Hello." She said hello. He said, fumbling only slightly, "I heard about the Eastfield deal. Congratulations. That's a major project." She thanked him. She turned back to her forms. He stood there for a moment, and she could feel him wanting to say something else. Something that would reposition that October afternoon. Something that would make it okay. But there was nothing to say. There had never been anything to say. What had happened in that room was not a mystery or a miscommunication. It was exactly what it looked like. They both knew it. After a moment, he went back to his forms. She finished hers. She picked up her copies. She walked out into the parking lot, where her second-hand Subaru was waiting, and she drove back to her office, and she got on with her day. There is something I keep coming back to when I think about Harlow Dakarai's story. It would be easy to tell this as a triumph story. And it is, of course it is. But it is also a story about what it costs to be the person who walks into that room in the first place. Who sits across from that table. Who slides documentation across a surface and watches it not be picked up. Who walks out of an elevator and sits in a parking garage for 11 minutes. Not because she has been defeated. She hasn't, and she knows it. But because there is no version of this that doesn't cost something. Her father worked the timber yards for 31 years. He sat at town council meetings where nobody seemed glad to see him. He set aside something every month because he understood, very deeply, that certain people are not given the benefit of the doubt, and so you build something so solid that the doubt eventually becomes impossible. He left that understanding to his daughter. She turned it into 14 properties. Into a co-investment agreement on the largest private development project in Northern Ontario in a decade. Into 22 people with jobs and a company that is still growing. That is the heirloom. Not the deal, not the land. The knowledge, inherited, tested, and proved, of how to keep moving when the room has decided about you before you've said a word. If this story stayed with you, please leave a comment below. We read every single one. Tell us what part of Harlow's story hit you the hardest. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. That's how these stories find the people they're meant for. We'll see you next week on Heirloom Tales. Same time, same place. We'll have another one waiting.